All right, guys. Hello again. This is Emily Bass. I'm the program director at AVAC, and I'm going to be helping to moderate the call today. What I want to do is just do a quick roll call of some of the speakers that we hope to have on the line, or that we are going to have on the line that I hope are on already. And then we will get underway. I know that we have Mitchell Warren, AVAC's Executive Director, who's going to be giving us the context or the background for this call, so what's happened recently, what the history of the issue is. And then I know that Bjorn Roos Snyder is on, Lillian Moreko, and Margaret Happy from ICW East Africa. I believe that you're on. It's *7 to unmute your line, if you can do that.
This
Lillian,
is Bjorn.
Hi, Bjorn. Great to have you. Jared Baton, have you joined us?
Good morning.
Good morning. Good very early morning. Dazon Dixon Diallo?
Good morning.
Great to have you. Mike Chirenge? Mike Chirenge, Dr. Mike, it's *7 to unmute, and we will work. These are always the most challenging calls to get out. We will figure out another way. And then Lillian and Happy from Uganda, it's *7 to mute if you can let us know that you can hear this. Okay. So what I'm going to do, that's helpful information, and what I'm going to do now as we solve the connectivity is turn it over to my colleague and comrade in this work, Mitchell Warren, who's going to give us, as I said, an overview for the topic that we're engaging in. We'll pause at the end to see if there are any questions around the background and the issue itself. You can also, again, email them to emily@avac.org. And our chat interface window is frozen right now. So we hope to have that up and running so that you can enter things virtually as well. But for now, over to you, Mitchell.
Great. Well, thank you, Emily, and thank you all for making the time for this call. I think as many of you know, this is not the first time we've had webinars on this topic, broadly speaking, and there's a very long history to it, which I don't intend to go through in any great detail, but want to make sure that everyone on the call, whether you are on this for the 5th or 6th time over a number of years, or whether you're coming in this very new after last week's updated guidance from the World Health Organization, wanted to be sure that there was some sense of why and how this conversation has evolved. It goes back a number of years and a number of observations based on data that had been collected for other purposes that began to identify and raise issues for a number of people, both in the research community and in the reproductive health, family planning, and HIV worlds, and particularly in the communities, that there was an indication that perhaps at least one hormonal contraceptive, DMPA or Depo-Provera as it is known in different parts of the world, might actually increase the risk of acquiring HIV. And we are always trying to be very careful with the language there because these were observations. They were based on data collected for in other studies. But clearly it began a series of conversations in a number of communities. It really accelerated back in 2011 when data was actually presented, and delighted that Jared Baton from the University of Washington is on the line. He and colleagues were involved in a study and presented actually at the International AIDS Society meeting in Rome that year that actually added to this observational evidence that perhaps indeed Depo-Provera was increasing the risk of acquisition. The World Health Organization set into motion a number of processes. A series of meta-analyses were done, and I believe Chelsea Polis, who's been deeply involved in many, if not all of those analyses, is on the line too. additional analyses were done. The World Health Organization convened a series of meetings, and at the time, finally in I think about 2012, issued a slight update to what they call their medical eligibility criteria. And I should say, as I describe much of this, background materials are available on the AVAC website, and the links were sent out, I think, with this call invitation. And one of the newer documents just simply tries to help us all understand in very plain language what these medical eligibility criteria are. And every contraceptive goes through that process. And in 2012, the World Health Organization added an asterisk behind the number. So contraceptives get numbers. DMPA had a 1, which meant it can be used without any concerns, and they added an asterisk that said for women at risk of HIV, there was an important need to recommend the additional use of condoms based on all of that observational data. And a number of conversations unfolded from there. A number of research activities began to set in motion, and you'll hear shortly about the ECHO trial, which is looking to provide data from an actual randomized trial that's trying to give even higher quality evidence to help answer some of these questions. But in the midst of this, a great deal of conversations and questions continued to evolve. And you'll also hear not only from Emily from AVAC, but also from Lillian and Margaret from ICW East Africa, who've led a remarkable process over the last 5 years of engaging voices to try to inform some of this conversation. As it happens, both Emily and Lillian were part of an updated WHO meeting that took place late last year to consider additional information, and in fact another meta-analysis published last year, presented at the Durban AIDS Conference by Chelsea, that began to provide even a greater degree of information on this topic. And again, I'll let the various people on this call describe it. And that meeting took place in December, and a recommendation was made within a WHO convened process that resulted in last Thursday, the World Health Organization issuing updated contraceptive guidance that showed that in fact the progestogen-only injectable contraceptives, including DMPA and NET-N, two quite widely used injectable contraceptives, actually were changed to a medical eligibility criteria, or MEC, a term you'll hear a lot, to a MEC 2, which raises the issue of theoretical risk. It is very clear that the benefits remain and outweigh that theoretical risk, but it does now officially describe the potential as a theoretical risk, which is a change in language. I think what's really important, and before I turn it back to Emily to really moderate the full discussion, is the process obviously has to look at lots of information coming from country programs, from research activities. But I think to their great credit, the World Health Organization and the external group that met in December and provided the analysis and this recommendation did it very much from the guiding principle that women needed to have full information, that the decisions at the end of the day must be made by the user in consultation with providers and others with information, but that information really must come from a woman-centered and rights-based approach. And I think that, irrespective of what MEC or other acronyms we throw around today, I think is paramount to all of our desires, whether we are advocates or researchers or policymakers or program implementers, that the rights-based, information-based approach is key. That is a very brief summary, from my perspective at least, of where we've been and where we're going, and now the important conversations about what does this actually mean? What does it mean for family planning programs? What does it mean for HIV prevention programs? What does it mean for public health? What does it mean for research that is ongoing and perhaps other research to come? And how do we ensure that all of us remain part of that conversation, just as Lillian and Margaret and Emily have pioneered that way over the last 5 years. So with that, I will stop. I'll turn it back to Emily to begin making sure you get a lot more information from the key people on this, but we wanted to be sure there was just this broad sense of how we got to March 10th, and now the conversation of what do we do from March 10th going forward. Emily? All right. I don't know if Emily might be dialing out to some others. Lillian and oh, there you are. Great.
No, I had not unmuted myself. I forgot the magic code. What I was saying is that I wanted to pause, as promised, to see if there were any questions for people about the guidance change itself, what the language says, what it means, that we can take and then either pass on to speakers or answer now as we go into the more contextualizing conversation. But as Mitchell said, there's a range of resources that AVAC and partners have put together. But I do want to give people a chance just to flag the basic questions they have. It is *7 to unmute, or you can email me at emily@avac.org. Right now, we still don't have our chat window open, so such is life. So let me just pause. Are there any questions just about background and information that we want to get on the table now? *7 to unmute. Okay. We're going to pause throughout and also hope that people will weigh in and will email questions.
Hi, Emily.
Yeah, go ahead.
Hi, this is Dazon. I'm sorry. I'm known for speaking into mute first just to see if I sound okay to myself. But so I know I'll be responding from a U.S. perspective in just a moment. But I did have one clarifying question that actually came up in a meeting the other day, and that is some folks are familiar with the 2012 guidance, or not guidance per se, but guideline recommendation, if you will, that came from the WHO, and ask the question, how does that distinguish from what was released by the WHO last week?
So your question is, how is this new guidance different from the 1-star for the previous DMPA guidance?
Yeah.
Okay.
From the time when the WHO, in my own pedestrian understanding of it, when the WHO sort of released a more cursory recommendation that women in situations that are greater risk for HIV should consider using condoms. And people, at least one person in a recent meeting asked, how is that different from the guidance that was just released in terms of the changes?
That is a great question. So I really encourage people to ask for the basic, or that's not basic at all, but to ask for those kinds of questions now and as we go through. So the way that the medical eligibility criteria work, and that is a grading system that WHO has in place for all contraceptive methods, and there's many in there, and they are the data on many different aspects of contraceptive safety and use are evaluated and then graded in this quite large book. So what was put out specific to hormonal contraceptives is a small guidance. This will also then go into the medical eligibility criteria, or MEC, as you often hear it called. The MEC itself is a numerical grading. The medical eligibility criteria goes 1, 2, 3, and 4. Most of what we're going to be talking about today are methods that fall into 1 and 2 categories. The 1 category is used without restriction, and the 2 category is the benefits outweigh the theoretical or proven risks. In addition to getting a number, a 1 or a 2, there is a column adjacent to that, if you actually look at the layout of how this guidance is put out, that gives background and information for the reason for the classification, so that if you're a provider or a policymaker or an advocate trying to understand how a given method is graded, you see both the grade and the reasoning. So the biggest change right now, based on what WHO did last week, is in the grade. Okay, the grade for DMPA and for NET-N, for 2 progestin-only contraceptives, was changed from a 1 with a little asterisk next to it, and the asterisk said, hey, pay attention to what we have to say about this, So change from a 1, which is used without restriction, but pay attention to what we have to say about this, to a 2, which is theoretical or the benefits outweigh the theoretical or proven risk. The accompanying language is essentially the same. So in the sense that both the asterisk, which guided people to say, hey, pay attention to this, and then the new language explaining the 2 basically says there is a possibility that DMPA and NET-N increase women's risk of acquiring HIV. It's a possibility. It's not proven. However, in light of that possibility, we have to act. We have to tell women about this possibility, and we have to counsel them to use appropriate prevention, including male and female condoms and PrEP. So the actual what to do about the guideline has changed. Daison, to answer your question, has not changed. But the numeric change is significant in that I think it's, and I really hope other speakers will weigh in, and we will, now I'm moving from clarification into opinionification, which people have heard me do before. It's significant in that it is clearer. Okay, a 1 with an asterisk is not a category that is very clear how to navigate, how to use. A 2 is a category that exists. It says, listen, most women should use this without restriction, but there are theoretical or possible risks, and we're recognizing that and saying that people should hear about them so that they can make informed choices. So there is an increased clarity, in my view, in terms of the grade system. What you do with it is, as far as the recommendation, is largely unchanged. So I hope that is clear and certainly open to have other folks correct and weigh in as we go on. Any other quick or not quick clarifying questions before we turn it over to our first speaker?
Hello? Leah Hazen.
Go ahead.
I'm not sure this is the right time for the question, but I just wondered if at some point there could be some discussion about why NET-N was included, given that the data from the most recent meta-analysis suggested actually less risk.
Yep. That is a great question. I will say, again, let me just say at the outset, WHO was not able to join the call at this time. They're going to be able to do a webinar on April 24th, so look for an invitation for that. So some of these questions, this contextualizing panel is not going to be able to fully address, but we can talk about why that is such an important question and what the perspectives are on it. So noted. I now have the chat window open. I don't know if others do. So you can also, there should be a web interface now, but I'm glad people are unmuting. Any last clarifying questions before we move on? *7 to unmute.
This is John Townsend. Could I ask a question?
Sure.
I welcome the voice of clients. It's really particularly important in an area that's been highly medicalized. And from an ethics point of view, the engagement of communities is really important. To help people understand better, it'd be helpful to review what is the absolute risk associated with the practice of using DMPA, and what's the relative risk compared to using another product with the same prevailing level of behavior and so on. And just to clarify, there's no new significant direct evidence on the association from the recent review. There is some clarification about some potential alternative hypotheses, but could someone clarify that, Chelsea or others? Warren?
There's a question about the absolute risk associated with DMPA?
Yes. So we're talking about going from 1 to 2, but communities don't, in most users, clients don't understand the MEC 1 to 2, and if they have to assess their own risk, what is the absolute risk they'd be facing of using DMPA, and what's the relative risk compared to a prevailing level of risk if they added a DMPA to their current practice?
So what I'm going to do, and that's a great question. Before we try to answer that, and there, obviously there's there is no absolute answer to the relative risk. There are calculations that were in the most recent systematic review about a possible point estimate for increased risk. And we can go back over that. I know we have Chelsea on the phone. But what I want to do now is pick up with the agenda because our first speaker is Lillian Moreko from the International Community of Women Living with HIV based in Uganda. And she and her colleague Margaret Happy have really led the civil society effort to engage with this data, to engage with the uncertainty, and to articulate the civil society agenda for what needs to happen. And I think that the question of what women can absorb, understand, and act on, and what in the ways in which it needs to be communicated is something, John, that you just raised really articulately in one way, and that ICW East Africa and the civil society groups that it has been working with have really grappled with as well. So I'm going to turn it over to Lillian. I do hope, again, people will find our resources. On our resources page, there's a statement called Now More Than Ever that really reflects the analysis of the civil society working group and many of the coalition partners who have been following this issue closely on what happens now. And I hope, fingers crossed, we're fortunate to have Lillian and Margaret on the line to talk a bit about what this development means and what should happen next. So, Lillian, do you hear me and are you able to speak now? Lillian? All right. We never know with the conference call, gods, what's going to happen. I'm showing that Lillian is on the line. I will try to get her back. The other speaker that we have that's contextualizing this, again, from an Africa-based perspective, is Dr. Mike Chirenje from University of Zimbabwe, who is a reproductive health advocate, researcher, and practitioner, really working across the range of issues that this touches, from HIV prevention to contraceptive provision and policy, and is also working from and in a country where there is a highly successful condom program and also high uptake of oral contraceptives, which is not always typical of the region, right? Injectables are quite frequently used in East and Southern Africa. So we wanted to ask Dr. Mike to talk about what the MEC2 change means to you as a provider and key stakeholder in contraceptive policy, and what you feel are the key next steps at a country level to act on this guidance. So, Dr. Mike, I have fingers crossed that you're on the line. Can I turn this over to you?
Okay, thank you for that introduction. I hope you can hear me clear.
Yeah, beautifully. I'm so happy. Thank you.
Can you hear me well?
Yes, beautifully. Thank you. Go ahead.
So thank you for this opportunity, and thanks for all the colleagues who have joined. So I think my response would be, as a provider for contraception for women, I'm a provider for contraception for a lot of women who come both in our research unit. I work in a tertiary hospital in the medical school where we have a gynecological clinic where lots of women come for contraceptive care. And Zimbabwe is an HIV endemic country, as most of you know. So what really strikes me with the new policy guideline from WHO moving the DNPA, I will only refer to DNPA for Zimbabwe because our women do not have access to NETN. So moving to LEC2, category 2 as they call it, it strikes me as an individual and my colleagues that I spoke with in my clinic this morning that it strikes us just as a reminder that it's now our obligation to counsel all women adequately on the advantages of using DNPA that outweigh the possible risk of increased HIV activation. So really, it's more like an opportunity for health providers of really a well-documented, informed consent process where a decision for a woman who's going to
Sorry, hello?
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 Lillian, I'm just trying to figure out if we've got the rest of the call on. Mitchell or Jackie?
Yeah, no, I think everyone's still on. I think we lost Mike, though.
We lost Mike. Okay, I couldn't tell where the silence came from. Well, you know, maybe the deal for the day is we get one speaker at a time from a hard-to-connect country. So what I'm going to, our colleague Michael can try to get Dr. Mike back. And we do also have Lillian and Happy on the line right now. So, again, I know everyone on this call cares about this field and therefore works across difficult connectivity. So thanks for your patience. What I'd like to do, Lily and I had introed you before when you weren't on the phone, but it's to give you a chance to talk about what you feel like this development means for women living in affected communities and what you hope will happen next.
Thank you very much, Emily. I'm here with Margaret Happy, who is going to be speaking on behalf of us. And Margaret, please. Hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Thank you so much for giving us the opportunity to talk about the implication of the decision of classifying hormonal contraception from MEC 1 to MEC 2 and what should happen from the perspective of women from diverse groups. We did thorough analysis of the global guidance, the updated guidance, and we highlighted a few things. We also had our concerns, but also came up with some recommendations. Among the key, I will specifically focus now on the key concerns that women from diverse groups came up with, and one of them is in terms of communicating the risk, communicating the implication of MEC reclassification and the way how it is said that women at high risk should be informed about the possibility of an association between DMPA and HIV risk. But for us, the concern is it should not be at the discretion of the healthcare providers, determining who should be informed about the possibility of risk. Instead, we propose that all women seeking contraception and all protection against sexually transmitted infections and expressing interest to use Provera or any injectable method should be advised in a fully respectful, non-judgmental, routine way of a possibility of associated risk. And also, we had a concern on messaging. We said we agreed that programs must urgently expand a comprehensive contraceptive prevention so that women can have access to full and non-judgmental information and comprehensive options that are available, accessible, affordable, and of high quality. Those are some of the areas of concern that were raised by women from the diverse, and we raised several recommendations for consideration in implementation of the updated guidelines. Among which we recommended that women, actually we demand that countries and standards follow the WHO guidance and prioritize increased access to a range of long-acting medicines. At the same time, the investment by the funders and countries should ensure that women are able to make their own decisions based on full information and available, accessible, and acceptable range of options. And we are saying no woman who chooses to use DMPA or better after discussion with her provider should be denied the choice regardless of her HIV risk. And we are also saying that civil society groups with expertise, with experience, talking about method risks and the benefits are at the heart, it should be at the heart of implementing this guidance in a woman-centered services that consciously adopt the perspective of women. So those are some of the key things that we recommended. And maybe final about adolescent girls and young women. We say we agreed that a range of contraceptive and HIV prevention options be made available at health facilities, particularly designed to meet the needs of the adolescent girls and the young women. And we are calling for adolescent girls and young women friendly health services. And it's an urgent step which must be given the high priority by the different stakeholders at different levels.
Thanks so much, Yeah, that was great. Thanks so much, Happy. I am going to again urge people to, and I will post in the chat window, I'm going to urge people to read the full statement, now more than ever, that Happy was paraphrasing, that reflects the inputs and analysis of the members of the Civil Society Working Group, Advocacy Working Group on HCHIV, which Happy leads. And it has 82 members from a range of countries. And some of the key points that I am just going to restate, because I know we're working across, literally across lines of stakeholder identity and much more. But some of the key points, one is noting that this, and then perhaps Dr. Mike, you can also weigh in on this, that one of the things in the language accompanying the grade, and for those of you that joined at the beginning, I was talking about how there is both a numerical grade known as a medical eligibility criteria, so there's a numerical grade and an explanatory text, and that the text accompanying the two says that women at high risk of HIV should be informed about the uncertainty, the possibility that that DMPA and NET-N increase risk of HIV. And one key concern is who gets to assess that risk. And the feedback in now more than ever is that this not be a provider decision whether they believe a woman is at risk or not, but rather that all women have the information about all methods. So that is a key piece. Another key piece, and this is a great segue back to Dr. Mike, is about method mix, and that ideally you want to be in a situation where women are being informed about the possibility that a method could impact their risk of HIV, and that women that say, you know what, that means that that's a great method for me, I'm still going to use it. Those women can still use it without judgment, regardless of their HIV risk. And women that say, you know what, I'd like something else, but it really needs to have similar qualities, whether that is long-acting or discreet or something else, has access to that comparable option. And so getting that comparable option on the shelf in many countries where Depo is the only long-acting discrete method available, getting that long-acting alternative is really critical. And so that's another thing that you hear emphasized very much that Happy was just talking about then is in the statement as well. Mike, are you back on, and can you hear me? It's *7 to unmute, because I did want to come back to you. You were talking about the importance of informing women about this development, and I wanted to give you a chance to finish your remarks. Okay. AVAC Mike, if you can see if we can get Dr. Mike back on, we can try and loop him in again. Any other panelists want to comment right now? From Lillian and from the beginning of Mike, we were talking about acting on this guidance in a sub-Saharan African context, East and Southern particularly, and we're going to be moving a bit into the U.S. context. But I want to give anyone who wants to weigh in a chance at this point. Okay.
Emily?
Yeah. Hi, Anna.
Hi, it's Anna Forbes. I don't know if you're taking questions, but I just wanted to ask. It's a little off topic, but are we really anticipating that there is going to be an increased investment in expanding the method mix? Because it seems to me as though it's critically important to talk about why that needs to happen and why women need access to a broad method mix. But we know that the reality is that in a lot of areas that's not the case. And I wondered if we've seen any indications from IPPF or FP 2020 or other initiatives indicating a willingness to invest in expanding the method mix.
Thanks, Anna. That's a great question. It's a really good question, and what I want to do, I think, is move into. So the short answer in the weekend day or so since the classification was changed, there hasn't been a lot of public pickup. There hasn't been a lot of news, and there also haven't been a lot of public responses. The ECHO trial, which we'll hear from later. Is that Mike back?
Yeah, it's Mike. I'm on.
Oh, great. Okay. So, Anna, I'll come back to you. Mike, thank you for your bearing with us. We did want to let you finish your remarks, and thank you again for your patience. So this question, and it actually relates, I don't know if you heard the end of it, the question was just about, how practically are women going to get access to more methods if method mix is one of the things that is suggested by this change in classification, which seems like a great place to turn it back over to you to talk about the implications at the country level. And thank you again for your patience.
Yes, so sorry for the interruption, but if I can just go back and finish what I was saying, which I briefly said that as providers, I briefly met my colleagues I work with in medical school, and what strikes us is that we looked at this as an opportunity for us to go back to our obligation for essentially informed consent when we provide contraception. So we looked at it as an opportunity to just remind our patients, our female patients working in an endemic country where HIV infections occur, particularly in subpopulations, just when they are going to continue with DNPA or they are going to initiate DNPA, we just have to have this opportunity to now tell them that the evidence seems to tell us that being on DNPA is a good thing. It outweighs the possible increased risk of the HIV activation. And that we also emphasize that, particularly in Zimbabwe, we have various prevention methods to prevent that HIV. We have a very high uptake of condoms. We are rolling out PrEP, where those who are infected are on antiretroviral treatment so that they don't transmit the infection to their uninfected partners. So we look at this as an opportunity for informed counseling so that when she makes a decision for contraceptive use, it's a weighed decision, which is very clear that there is a possible risk, but that risk really is not should be measured against because we do have women who come from rural areas, areas where they could be just depot. So we don't want them to feel that they should not use depot because the possibility of unwanted pregnancy is really there in our community. So in terms of policy, I have not been able to find a person from the ministry, but I do not expect this to be a major change in policy. But what will probably happen at ministry level is that through Zimbabwe National Family Planning, they will not raise any alarm bells based on this migration to M2. But what we'll probably write is it will probably be through a communication channels to just inform providers that they need to counsel women who are coming from contraception to be aware that there is a possibility of increased risk of HIV activation. So that's really where I was saying we will emphasize that provision of HIV care. Zimbabwe has done well in terms of control of HIV. our prevalence rate has really dropped from 27% to about 18%, and our incidence rates are quite low. And we emphasize that those gains are essentially through condom use and provision of PrEP for the high-risk population. And then we are really expanding method mix at the country level. We are rolling out implants. We are training more providers, including nurses. And there's a discussion in the Zimbabwe National Family Planning to train more providers for IUCDs. So in that mix here, we are also saying women should also be aware that these adequate prevention methods are available in the country. So that's where I'll stop, unless you want me to add some more.
That's really helpful. Thank you, Dr. Mike. The one thing that based on what Lillian and Happy were saying, and I think you dropped off for part of it, is the sense from women that all women should be informed about this, regardless of their HIV risk. And I'm curious, even yet the language says women at high risk of HIV should be informed. In a country like Zimbabwe, where prevalence is extremely high across the country, this may not be your impulse may be to inform all women, but I'm curious about your reading of that and your thoughts about how to implement a guidance that suggests the information should be delivered in the context of an HIV risk assessment for a woman, or just simply delivering it to all women.
Correct. So what we clearly know is that we have had all these errors where certain categories of women, i.e. women who work in the sex industry, or women who are in discordant couples, are the corners that people consider high risk. But we have not taken that approach because we consider all women in our communities to be the high risk. We have that evidence whereby even in monogamous relationships, women do seroconvert because their partners are doing something else. So our approach is very clear that provision of contraception at any given point, if there's counseling for HIV, we do not discriminate those who are monogamous compared to those who may have multiple sexual partners or history of STI. The counseling script is essentially the same because it's very complex to dilute it to just individual risk groups, because our epidemic is across the country. It's a completely homogeneous epidemic, urban, rural, low density, high density. It's tertiary college. It's all over the country. So any woman seeking contraception, when we give a script for counseling, we'll use the same script. We'll not discriminate.
Thanks so much. Super helpful. And I think, some really important things to hear and to think about, one of them being that there's a strong desire to minimize alarm or migration away from a method that for many women is still the only thing that they can access that has the characteristics that many women need in terms of being discreet, not requiring daily adherence, and so on. So paraphrasing again for those who are trying to listen on the line, that one of the things that Dr. Mike and his colleagues have been discussing in Zimbabwe is a real need to ensure that that the classification, which is the benefits outweigh theoretical or proven risk, is very much delivered as such, so that any woman who needs this method, regardless of HIV risk, continues to be able to access it, and then figuring out communications pieces around it to ensure that that message is conveyed, and moving forward with the method mix. I'm going to move on now to two speakers who can talk about, who are based here in the U.S., and can speak to both the implications in the U.S. and globally, insofar as the U.S. is a major funder of global health interventions and is in the midst of quite difficult and sobering time in terms of government moves to change our relationship to funding for abortion-related services, and family planning. Our first speaker is Faison Dixon Diallo, who is the fearless leader of Sister Love, and has been working alongside us with this issue, with related issues in HIV prevention for many, many years. we often think about HIV and the HIV, hormonal contraception, and HIV question as pertaining to East and Southern Africa, where rates of HIV prevalence in women are very high, as are rates of usage of DMPA. Very similar conditions obtain for women of color in the American South and in other parts of this country. Very high rates of HIV and higher than average rates of depot use, injectable use, compared to the comparable women in other geographic regions and of other races. So the question about what this means is very relevant in the U.S. as well. So, Dezan, we wanted to hear from you. What does this mean in the U.S. and in the various contexts that you're working in and watching this?
Sure. Thank you so much, Emily, and thanks to the leadership of Lillian and to Happy and Lillian and a whole bunch of other folks on the HC/HIV advocates group, as well as some of the other advocates and partners that we've been working with over the years around the intersectional questions of sexual and reproductive justice and the role that HIV plays into that. And I start out with that because two things. First, I don't think we actually have the answer on what this development means, particularly for women of color in the U.S. In the immediate sense, because unlike the conversations that we've been able to hold with the HC/HIV advocates group and the Now More Than Ever process, is that because depot use, particularly, and I also want to echo Tyler's question around why net-in was included, but particularly around the depot use in the United States is considerably lower when looking at the different contraceptive methods and options that are available to women in the United States. Nonetheless, for the depot prescriptions and the utilization and the uptake in the United States, there's a conundrum of the fact that women of color, particularly black women and Latinas, are disproportionately, if I can use that word, using depot compared to the other populations. So the majority of folks, even though it's significantly lower among the contraceptive options that are accessed in the United States, among those who do access depot, it's primarily at about 55+% among black and Latino women. And so that lends itself to some other considerations around how provider bias, as well as the need for all the same reasons that depot is a likelier choice for women in sub-Saharan Africa, around convenience, around health coverage or insurance coverage for the cost of the prescription, and the medical visits, that all of these are real considerations to why depot is still an important method to access. I would say that when the initial controversy around the studies that Jared and other folks were involved in, and I call them controversies, and I call it actually the beautiful conflict for a while, because unlike so many other issues that have been highlighted by the advent of the HIV epidemic, this particular question raised what I call the beautiful conflict between reproductive rights advocates and HIV advocates, or HIV and women advocates, because for a very long time, I think probably since the initial prescription guidelines, the so-called black boxes added to the inserts, that it had greater implications and indications around effects on bone mineral density came about. Lots of reproductive rights advocates organizations, all of which are North American that I know of, and none of which had a specific HIV focus, all came in pretty solid opposition to depot being used at all. There are some other places I know, like in India, and places that were opposed to DMPA use as well. But this created a conflict for those of us who were looking at the role that contraceptive method mix, as well as HIV prevention, play for women who are at greater risk of HIV. And so this has been one of the largest considerations in terms of this new development, is how do we begin to articulate in advocacy communities around what this distinction means? Does it actually validate the pretty strong position that many reproductive rights advocates have taken wholesale against DMPA versus those of us who recognize the value and sometimes weigh the value of the opportunity to access DEPO alongside the risks of HIV. So 2 things I would say coming out of this is that we will need to, obviously, in the context of Anna's question as well, continue to inquire how in, let me just say, in the social cultural context, or in an even more cultural competency context, that we already know that that DEPO is disproportionately prescribed for other reasons, like around adherence, for provider bias towards women of color, towards poor women, in terms of provider convenience, even if I can use that word, that we have to be careful to recognize how the conversations inside doctors' offices and community health centers and public health clinics will go forward regarding the risks associated with HIV and the new changes in the WHO guidelines. One thing that was made clear in a response in a meeting that we just had, the U.S. Women in PrEP Working Group, just earlier this week, is that the United States has its own regulatory processes and guidelines, namely coming out of the FDA and HHS through the Centers for Disease Control, and that providers in the United States are going to go by the CDC and the FDA guidelines. They're not necessarily going to follow what WHO says and does. And so that presents a different question for those of us who are doing the advocacy work in the United States, is to inquire whether the CDC and the FDA are going to look at the WHO guidelines and make similar changes or recommendations. And I think that there's a lot of considerable work in advocacy, so that would be my second thing in terms of what this development means, is that there will more than likely need to be a significant increase in the advocacy, as well as in addressing this thing I call the beautiful conflict in the United States, to push our regulatory and guideline bodies to look at this issue distinctly for women in the U.S. and let us know what the outcomes are so that we have a way forward in this. I want to close on saying that for women in the U.S. South in particular, aside from what we may look at, the economies of scale or even the epidemic of scale, the issues are all the same. The gender inequality, the conservative environment, the low level of condom use, the low level of information and education around the intersections of contraception and HIV prevention. There's also the question now of, if people are concerned about DEPO around the bone mineral density question, how does that reflect our education and implementation of PrEP use for women, especially women of color who are at greater risk around bone density and kidney issues. So these are real critical concerns, not only at the provider level, but also for us as advocates and health educators in the community on how we would present the information and what we would answer to women who ask the specific questions of what we think their best options and their best ways forward might be. And I want to thank y'all for the opportunity to share that.
Thanks so much, Faison. Thank you a great deal. What I'm gonna keep moving forward so that we have open discussion and on all of these different topics in the time that we have. Our next speaker is Bjorn Roos-Snyder from Change, Center for Health and Gender Equity in D.C., another longtime traveler, comrade, and advocate and great thinker in this space particularly, and then also following quite closely the developments related to the reinstatement and potential expansion of the global gag rule by the new American president. And the global gag rule, as I think everybody is probably aware, places, well, doesn't even place restrictions. It eliminates foreign funding, U.S. foreign assistance to family via our family planning budget line to foreign NGOs that talk about, refer for, provide, or advocate for legalization of abortion. many of those same NGOs also obviously have a lot of activity in the contraceptive space and are impacted when this rule is reinstated. So Bjorn is going to talk a little bit to us today about how to contextualize a development that certainly has a lot of us thinking about a need for increased access to contraceptive and information in the context of the implementation and possible extension of the gag rule. Bjorn, it's *7 to unmute if you are not already.
Hi, this is Bjorn. Can you hear me?
Bjorn?
Can you guys? Yeah.
Yes.
Can you?
There you are.
Okay.
Yeah.
Great.
Yep.
We can hear. Terrific. Well, so as Em said, I mean, the question about why we're talking about the global gag rule on a webinar about DMPA and HIV is a multitude of reasons. You know, as Dr. Mike and other people were saying, the way forward on managing all of this uncertainty on a clinic and provider and individual woman and girl level is to have robust conversations and informed consent and risk analysis. And informed consent relies on a meaningful method mix on site. And that, you know, as everyone has been saying, has been an ongoing challenge for funding and supply chain and procurement reasons. And the global gag rule simply just makes all of that so much harder. As Em said, on January 23rd, the new U.S. president imposed his global gag rule via a presidential memorandum. So this is not a legislative action. This is a presidential action. And it prohibits foreign non-governmental organizations that receive global health assistance from the U.S. government for advocating for abortion, providing it, or referring folks for abortion as a method of family planning. Historically, these restrictions have only applied to international family planning funds. So what I'm going to talk about in terms of impact is what we know historically, previous iterations of this, how it impacts health systems and women and girls from an international family planning fund perspective. That aspect of the global gag rule began to be implemented late last week with the release of a standard provision that is identical to the one we saw under the Bush administration for international family planning assistance. The second phase of this, which is the expansion of the global gag rule to all other global health assistance, is expected to come in the coming weeks. So we have a terrible policy that will now be expanded to likely about 15 times the amount of money that it was applied to under the Bush administration. So some of what we know happened when it was only applied to international family planning funds was an increase in unsafe abortion and therefore an increase in maternal mortality. We saw a loss in service in clinics, loss in contraceptive supplies, technical support, and equipment. There's some very specific examples in the research that we can sort of point to as examples of what we expect to see again. During the Clinton administration, Lesotho Family Planning Association was receiving about 426,000 condoms from USAID over 2 years. And when the GGR went back into effect in 2001 under President Bush, USAID had to suspend all of those condom shipments to Lesotho because Planned Parenthood was the only provider of condoms in the country. So at that time that condom shipments were ceased, 1 in 4 women in Lesotho were infected with HIV. So, you know, the relationship between providers' ability to even be able to meaningfully counsel women to use Depo in conjunction with condoms is severely undermined throughout health systems. There were a lot of closed and consolidated clinics across many many countries impacted, which in this context, of course, closed and consolidated clinics mean longer for women and girls to go, harder for them to get there, and making long-acting reversible contraceptives more appealing because of longer distances, harder to get appointments, harder to be able to get that done, which sort of shifts the balance on what it means to be able to have informed consent. There was, an increase in unwanted pregnancies across, where we're able to measure across quite a few of the countries impacted by the rule. There was a pretty dramatic curtailing of community-based outreach activities on contraception and counseling and provision, also condom distribution and HIV testing. So all of these sort of interconnected health systems got dislocated, slowed down. Access for contraception went down significantly in many countries and many regions and countries. And while policymakers have suggested that services can just be shifted, as they also are doing in the United States right now, while proceeding with very similar restrictions towards Planned Parenthood, people familiar with health systems know that that is simply not true, particularly in rural areas. And even where there is the potential for some shifting to government-run facilities that are not necessarily impacted by the global gag rule, there's good data on loss of provider trust, and that just many women and girls do not make the shift to a new provider. And when you're talking about something as complex as risk analysis and method mix, provider trust is a very real piece in what makes systems work. So that's what we've seen before. The things that have changed dramatically since the last time the global gag rule was in place include the DMPA HIV data, but it also includes a real push towards integrating health systems, integrating HIV and family planning at a site level, and a real shift in abortion laws. Many more countries have liberalized laws, which means that there are more countries that have been moving in a different direction, which will probably mean more providers are excluded from U.S. funding, again, creating more gaps in care and really impacting our ability to make method mix at a site level real. As Em suggested, one of the other outstanding challenges that the GGR compounds, because it's an existing challenge, is the investment gap. Before this, we did not have enough money to create we didn't have enough money to meet the unmet need, and now a lot of donor governments will be redirecting their funds to try to meet the GGR gap rather than focusing on method mix and trying to get away from single method rollout. So I will leave it there.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Bjorn. And this is there are a lot of different things that we're juggling as we absorb this guidance, and certainly one of them is the availability of funding for services that uphold sexual and reproductive health and rights for all people, and particularly for women. So thank you for that background and for leading the fight on this. I am conscious of time and also of some really great questions that have come in via the chat window. And so the last speaker that we have today is Jared Baton, who is a principal investigator on the ECHO trial, which is a randomized trial that is seeking to get more information and clarity about how different contraceptive methods impact women's risk of acquiring HIV. There are 3 methods, as Jared can explain, that are currently in the trial. DMPA, the Jadel contraceptive implant, and the copper IUD. And we invited ECHO on to give us a sense of what this change means for the ECHO trial. So, Jared, over to you.
Thanks, Emily. Can you hear me?
*7 to unmute. There you are. Okay.
Okay, good. And thank you. Thank you for having me talk after 6 a.m. In Seattle. So this is really a great opportunity, and it's fantastic to have followed all of these other colleagues of mine who have spoken so eloquently first about what this means across a really wide range of important issues for women. ECHO is just a piece of this discussion, but I think we're really honored and happy to be able to talk a little bit about this at the end of this call. The WHO recommendations have been well reviewed, but I think just in terms of framing for ECHO, they're incredibly important in their rooting in a rights-based approach and in making informed choices. And at its foundation, that is what ECHO is about, to provide the best information for women, for their clinicians to be able to counsel, and for policymakers to be able to make larger-scale decisions about family planning options, and to be able to provide the evidence to make those decisions, and provide evidence also of the ability to do a diverse method mix. ECHO, as Emily mentioned, is a randomized trial that is designed, the first randomized trial designed to assess the risk of HIV acquisition by women. It's using 3 methods, weighing, in the end, the relative risks and benefits of these 3 different methods, and they include the injectable DMPA, the implant made with levonorgestrel, branded as Jadel, and the copper-containing IUD. The study began in late 2015 and has enrolled well over half now, of the 7,800 women who are anticipated to be enrolled in the study. It's operating at 12 sites in South Africa, Kenya, Swaziland, and Zambia, and it is going. What I can say is it's going quite well. Following the release of WHO guidance, the Independent Data and Safety Monitoring Board, which includes experts from across the planet that is overseeing the ECHO study, reviewed the study progress. In fact, about 6 hours after the WHO information was fully available up online. The DSMB reviewed the data as well as the study team, reviewed the WHO recommendations as well as the study team, and the DSMB then reviewed the ongoing data for ECHO, and has recommended that ECHO continue. Is providing important information, and so continue as designed. ECHO team has been committed from before the inception. And I think Emily mentioned at the beginning, we have thought about this issue for many years, including the Heffron et al. Paper that started much of this conversation in 2011. And we are committed to really in ECHO to being attentive to exactly the information that WHO has conveyed in its most recent guidance, to provide women with, to make sure that women understand the possibility of increased risk, the uncertainty in the data, for which ECHO is really positioned well to help clarify, and as well the counseling on ways to reduce HIV risk. So all women who are within ECHO now and who will be entering will be informed of the new WHO guidance information as part of their participation in the study, and we feel more than ever that the need to resolve uncertainty in this field is heightened by this most recent information. So I think I'll pause there, and I hope we can have some opportunity for some questions before we hit the top of our time. Thank you, Emily.
Thanks so much, Jared, and all of the speakers. We have a bunch of questions, and so I'm going to go to the ones that have come in so far, and hope that we still have most, if not all, of the speakers on the line, including Dr. Mike and Lillian. But Jared, perhaps since you just finished speaking, there's 2 that you might want to speak to, and that I encourage other people to chime in on as well. One of them came in right at the beginning, and it's a question about what to make of the inclusion of net-N in this guidance, even as the systematic review that came out in earlier in 2016, looking across available observational data on a range of methods, came to the conclusion that there was no association, or no evidence, rather, for an association, no strong evidence with net N. Obviously, you were not part of the deliberations, so I'm not asking you to say how the decision was made, but perhaps to give what you are thinking about, grappling with, any questions or thoughts you have about that development. And then just to flag for all of the speakers, a really important and great question from Jane Nganga from Kavi in Kenya, speaking, I think, for a lot of people, says, I'm a bit confused since looking at this question, which has been around a while. What is the precise information that should be given to the clients? Jared, again, you guys are thinking about what to tell women coming into the trial, so perhaps that's a way to begin thinking about it and answering. Dr. Mike, you're looking and thinking about it in terms of women accessing services in Zimbabwe. So Jared, maybe a first pass at net N, and perhaps your version of key messages.
Thanks, Emily. As you noted, I nor any of the other ECHO investigators were part of the WHO deliberations in December. So whatever I'm saying now is speculation about why NET-N and DMPA are grouped together. They have been grouped together for in the medical eligibility criteria for some time now, because as progestin-based injectables. I think I suspect the continued grouping of them reflects part of the totality of information that WHO put out, which is that there is uncertainty in the data. And I think the uncertainty, while there is possibility, there is also uncertainty. So I guess I think of the WHO statement in terms of three ways: possible increased risk that women should know about, uncertainty in the data, and then other ways to protect oneself against HIV. The uncertainty in the data, I think, also would then carry forward to whether there's a clear ray of light that would be distinguishing DMPA from NET-N. And while I think there's emerging data that suggests they may be different and that NET-N would be lesser than DMPA, then it would be lesser than DMPA in terms of risk. I think if there's uncertainty about DMPA, then there carries forward to the uncertainty about NET-N being distinct. So that's my guess of why that they continue to be grouped, because there is a current, sadly, after years of continued assessment here, there continues to be a current of uncertainty in these data. As for messaging, the important message, and I think it's reiterated really well now, and it's so good to see the grounding in the importance of information conveyance and the shared decision-making and rights-based approach of the WHO statement, is that women need to know that there is a possibility for increased risk. And in ECHO, that discussion is at the time of whether a woman's deciding whether she wants to volunteer to be a part of the study, or whether she would like to receive contraception in a different way. Because everyone who considers ECHO can say, you know what, I don't want to be part of a study, and you know what, I want to have I want to choose exactly what contraceptive I like. And if there is the possibility of DMPA and increased risk is not appealing to her, she will choose the contraceptive of her choice and choose to get that not within the trial at the same center often, but not within the trial. I think Mike, it would be a great transition to Mike to talk about in programs what that conversation might look like now. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Jared. We are trying to get Mike back on the line. What happens? But thanks for those thoughts. I want to just go back to another question that came in virtually before, and please, if you've made it into the chat room, welcome. There are no slides, but you will see a chat interface where you can type your questions. You can also email them to me. One of the questions that came in was, it's great to hear that providers are viewing this change as an opportunity to cancel clients on risk of acquisition. Do you intend to cancel all women or to women choosing progestogen-only injectable how do providers plan to include the counseling for risk of HIV acquisition in FP service provision? So the middle piece of that, in terms of counseling women, all women or women choosing progestogen-only injectables, I think it's important to clarify and to reiterate that the only change in this guidance and the only methods for which there is a recommendation to counsel women about the possibility that use might impact the risk of HIV acquisition are DMP and NET-N. DMPA is a 3-month-long contraceptive injection. NET-N lasts for 2 months. They both use a similar synthetic hormone. So those are the only 2 methods at this point that WHO has graded as having benefits that still outweigh risks, but having a possible risk of HIV acquisition. So just the very basic level, the message is not to all women choosing all methods that there is an impact. Family planning does not across the board impact one's risk of acquiring HIV, and the methods we're talking about are 2 specific methods with a possible increased risk. Just want to be clear on that, and thank you for asking that very fundamental question. We had a question about how will providers determine women at high risk, and I think we've heard a couple of views. Dr. Mike saying very clearly in the Zimbabwean context where all women are at high risk by virtue of the epidemiological data, all women are getting this information. How they're going to get it, I think, is very much up in the air, as the guideline came out last week. The guidance came out last week, and I think understanding what the communications channels are and how that communication effort is complemented by expanded options and access to HIV prevention and contraception is really key, since information by itself is not going to address all of the issues that this raises. We had another question from John Townsend at the beginning about how do we talk about the absolute risk associated and then the relative risk of using or not using DMPA and NET-N. And we have Chelsea Polis on the line, who has helped to lead all of the systematic reviews on this question that have really helped inform the field. So Chelsea, I hope, is going to step in and give a little bit of context on what is known and unknown about the contribution to risk that might exist. So Chelsea, over to you if you're there. It is *7 to unmute, and I'm checking the mic. All right. Yet again, we are solving things as we go. I see a question. There will be a recording of this webinar that is going to be made available. Do other people have thoughts or questions that they want to raise at this point, either in the chat window, but also please come off mute if you want to. It's *7 to unmute.
Emily, this is Nina again. Go ahead.
Go ahead, Nina. Oh, go ahead. I heard Nina, and I heard a gentleman whose voice I couldn't recognize. So will the gentleman go ahead if you want to? It's *7 to unmute.
Yeah, no, it's Mike. I was giving the opportunity to the lady.
Oh, great. Yeah, thank you.
Because there was a question about what precise info to give to the client, and I want to take on just to add a point of what Jared very eloquently described. But the point I want to make is lots of our providers are working in very low resources, huge patient numbers, and the pressure for what really should be an ideal counseling script with adequate time is really a big problem in most of our centers, not just for Zimbabwe but in the region, because it's the same nurse who's doing vaccination, who's doing contraceptive service, who's doing sometimes antenatal clinic. So, but what we advise is that the message should be simple, and really it cannot miss the point of possible risk for HIV acquisition. That's the point. And for countries like Zimbabwe, the good thing is that with the data is clear, the women who come and request DMPA tend to be older women who are in more stable relationships, usually 30 and above. So it becomes easier because we know that the younger ones, 18 to 24, are in a transitional period that they, So my point was to add on Jared to say, in as much as we like adequate info in the informed process, the pressure for providers is very, very huge. So what we advise them is make the message simple, please. That was my addition. Thank you.
Thanks so much. I had another question come in, Jared, that I want to just turn back to you that's related to the ECHO trial. It comes from Erica Golub, who is another member of this community that's been following both the HC/HIV question and the ECHO trial really closely. And the question is, given that WHO has moved the MEC grade to 2 for DEPO, how does the ECHO team continue to justify the continuation, given that, and this is an interpretation, so given that the other methods do not have a MEC 2, which suggests that there's not an equal chance of benefit and risk across the different methods being tested, that DMPA has a riskier grade as the MEC conveys. And so what is the ethical rationale and the ethical analysis, given that this is a randomized trial, and one of these arms now has a possible risk associated with it that is directly tied to the study question? So, Jared, if you can walk us through a bit of the ethical analysis that you guys have taken. Erica addressed this question to AVAC as well. AVAC does not have a position on ECHO, but really feels, as we all have as we're absorbing this information, that the importance of understanding the ethical analysis that goes into all trials, including this one. So I'll turn it over to Jared, and also commit to AVAC's role with the HCHA, the advocacy group, of continuing to engage this more broadly.
And thanks, Emily, and thanks to Erica. This is an incredibly important question. The ethics of any trial are important to be assessed before, during, and even at the end of doing a study, as well as reporting on its results and interpreting them. We have continuously considered the ethical case for ECHO very strongly before we embarked, because it had not, while the idea of a randomized trial had been raised before, it had not been tried. And then, of course, now as the trial is going on and as information and interpretations continue to evolve. The ethical case, which we have reviewed with our study team, with our global advocacy group, with community advisory group, with CABs at each of our sites, with the overseeing IRBs, and with the overseeing DSMB, so a lot of people weighing in, continues to emphasize that there is possibility but uncertainty. And uncertainty in the data motivates still the need for clarification of information. The WHO statement indeed calls out for continued better information, including randomized information, which is exactly what ECHO is providing. I will point out that a couple of things. The MEC classification of 2 emphasizes that there is uncertainty information, possibility but uncertainty information, and benefits outweighing risk, for which more certain information could help clarify the decision process, both for individual women, for providers, and for larger things like the categorization of the MEC, potentially to even a different number if the information were more certain. The MEC also, I just want to clarify one error, the MEC classification for women HIV for the use of IUD is a 2 as well, I think with underlying other reasons related to STI risks and such, but regardless, the amount of information about HIV risk for both the implant and the IUD is incredibly limited, and lack of information it is a little bit dicey to interpret lack of information as completely reassuring. So I think ECHO, as it has moved forward, is continuously evaluating the ethical balance, of doing the trial and interpreting its results with not only the team but with external stakeholders who don't have a stake in the study as a study, but have a stake in providing the best information for women providers and policymakers, just like we do. And at this time, the consensus remains very strongly that the kind of information that ACTIM can provide can help shape and hopefully diminish much of the uncertainty that continues to revolve around this important question. Over, Emily.
Sure. Thanks so much. And I know that you have a hard stop about 4 minutes ago, so thank you for staying on to give us that answer. We are coming to the end of the 90 minutes that we'd set out for this call, and there's a lot that's been raised and a lot that we are still grappling with. Some really articulate points being made in the chat window for people that were able to see it. Chelsea, I don't know if you've sorted out your comms issue. We'd be happy to have you talk about relative risk, and then I'm going to turn it over to Mitchell Warren to wrap up.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Great, thank you. Good morning, afternoon, and evening, everybody, and thanks for all the great presentations. So John Townsend had asked about differences between absolute and relative risk. So I just wanted to try to briefly say that in the systematic review that we did, that I believe is linked in AVAC's materials, in Table 2, all of the incidence rates for each individual study are laid out in Table 2. So if people kind of want an understanding of the underlying incidence rates across individual studies, there's a range. So of course I'm not able to provide kind of one single figure for underlying absolute risk. And when we talk about relative risk, we're really talking about what would the estimated difference be between a woman who was not using DMPA and her risk of HIV and a woman who was using DMPA and a risk of HIV. And of course, as many people have stated, we're dealing in a realm of observational data, and so there's some degree of uncertainty around these estimates. But in combining those estimates across studies in a meta-analysis, with all of the caveats that come with combining data from observational studies in a meta-analysis, our best guess at the moment is that DMPA may be associated with an increased risk of HIV acquisition of about 40%. Other meta-analyses have found a relative risk of about 50%. And really unpacking what a relative risk of 40 to 50% means can be very challenging. And so I'm going to try to give a quick example of how we might understand that in kind of practical terms. If we look at the current HIV incidence rates in South Africa for a young woman aged 15 to 24 who's not using DMPA, based on data from South Africa, we know that she has about a 2.4% chance per year of getting HIV. Of course, any person's individual risk is going to depend on a lot of different factors, like her partner and whether he's circumcised using ART, whether she's using condoms, et cetera. But if we kind of take as a baseline that she has a 2.4% chance of HIV in a year, and if we take the assumption based on the meta-analysis with all the uncertainty inherent, that DEPO increases her risk by 40%, then what that means for her is that her risk has moved from 2.4% chance per year of getting HIV to a 3.3% chance per year of getting HIV. That is what would be represented by a 40% increase. Of course, if we look in settings where, or in populations where the underlying risk of HIV is greater, so for example, a woman having vaginal sex without a condom with an HIV-infected male partner, then her underlying risk starts much higher. And we know from meta-analyses in developing countries that a woman in a low-income country who has about 50 sex acts per year with an HIV-infected male partner who's not using ART and not using condoms, then that woman's HIV acquisition risk would start at about 14% without DMPA. For her, a 40% increased risk, if that is the real increase in risk with DEPO, then her HIV risk would increase to about 19%. So the overall point I'm trying to make is understanding that 40% increase really depends on what her underlying risk of HIV is per year and how much faith we are able to place in combining estimates from observational studies in a meta-analysis. So I hope that's helpful in kind of unpacking what those figures mean. Over.
Thanks so much, Chelsea. We had Chelsea do a great presentation when the systematic review came out with really excellent slides on this. They're on our website, but what I will do when we get off this call is make sure that they're readily available and accessible for people who want that background. And that slide set also talks through what is known and unknown at this point about NET-N, which is the piece that Jared was raising, or the question that was raised that Jared was addressing. With that, and with great thanks to everyone who hung on the line, I'm going to turn over to Mitchell Warren to wrap up. I will again say, please watch your inboxes for an invitation to another webinar on this topic where WHO will actually be on the line and be able to address questions again. Some of the same questions. I would love to hear the WHO perspective, and also it's going to be in about a month, so there will be the opportunity to ask for more detail on the implementation of communications guidance and other pieces that would really wrap around this and make the change in guidance a reality at the country level. With that, over to you, Mitchell.
Great. Well, thank you, Emily, and thank you all for staying on the line. We have the opportunity to see the numbers and to see that so many of you have stuck with it. Complex issues, challenging conversations, and certainly challenging technology as well, just in keeping a call going. But I'm really grateful for all of you for being on this call. As I said at the very outset, this is not the first conversation around this. Many of you have been on a number of these calls hosted by us or any number of other people, and it's certainly not the last of these calls. I think if anything came out from today, it's that each of these milestones of research coming out, of analyses being conducted, of meetings being held, of trials being started, of recommendations being updated, not one of them fundamentally answers the question. In fact, every one of those milestones over the last 6 years at least, and longer for many of you, has answered some questions and triggered a new range of questions, and you saw that today. And I think it's incumbent on all of us, no matter where we sit geographically or where we sit in terms of our work in this field, the urgency to really come to terms with what we do know and what we don't know, what we believe. What we believe as opposed to what we know, which are often different things, and how we take this work forward. And I do want to just say one thing, because I think this call really highlighted something that has been a thread for the number of years, and that many of us on this call come from an HIV focused activity. Many others on this call come from a reproductive health community. Our great hope is, I think as Dazan said at the beginning of her comments, that we're all looking at this as a much broader sexual and reproductive health and rights conversation. This is not about HIV or about contraception. This is about sexual and reproductive health and rights. And that's easy to say, much harder to do in terms of driving forward operationally what we do with this information. And I apologize in advance if anyone really thought they were joining this call to get an aha moment with an answer, but hopefully a series of aha moments with understanding of some different perspectives, whether you're hearing from Mike Chirenje in Zimbabwe as a provider, whether you're hearing from Lillian and Margaret Happy from a community in Uganda working with women across East and Southern Africa, whether you're hearing from U.S. allies or from the ECHO trial team. We've got to together figure out the way forward. And again, very easy to say, much harder to do. I do want to say that in addition to the call coming up in April with WHO, there is a real sense of need for a series of additional conversations amongst researchers thinking about ECHO, as Erica's question raised and as Jared's answer reflected, and really understanding what is the basis for that trial now. Does it need to evolve in a particular way, and if so, what is that way? And there need to be conversations, certainly with the much larger reproductive health and family planning conversations, whether that's FP 2020 or other contraceptive programs that have really been driving forward to expand contraceptive delivery in countries around the world. What does it mean for them? So in every one of these pieces, we've got to make sure that there are conversations going forward. and again, clearing more from WHO is going to be absolutely critical. So we do ask that in addition to waiting for your email to get the confirmation of the date and time for that call, please do let us know your questions, and so we can really make best use of that call with WHO. And you can send those to emily@avac.org or avac@avac.org, and we can really look at what needs to happen in these conversations going forward. If there are additional materials either that you all have, and I think a number of questions came up in the chat box. How do we talk about this? It's in terms of not just with a provider talking to a woman, but how do community groups, whether working in HIV or reproductive health, how do we talk to clients, to peers about these issues? If you have materials that you think really help make that case, we'd love to be sure to highlight those. If you don't have those materials but are keen to get them, let us know that too, whether we need to create a new or be able to source them from other places, because nothing about this is easy, and we do want to make sure that there are materials that really help understand what we know and what we don't know and what needs to happen next. So obviously a range of things that need to happen next, and really want to make sure we have platforms and places where these conversations can unfold with everybody. I do want to thank one and all for joining the call, certainly those resource people for providing insights, and to all of you for being part of a conversation, and really want to encourage you to find ways to work with each other and with us and drive forward. And I want to make a particular thanks to Lillian Mareko and Margaret Happy at ICW East Africa, who have been really pioneers and leaders in this conversation, and amazing partners, and really leading a lot of this work, although sometimes, as you hear, complicated with some of the phone technology, but really grateful for that. And then finally, just to say, one thing that I think all of us talked about in 2011, coming out of the analysis then, was the need to expand the method mix, both for HIV prevention as well as for contraception. And I think we do need to take a very clear view collectively and say, have we accomplished anything since 2011? Has the true method mix changed and evolved? Again, it is very easy to make recommendations and calls for an expanded method mix, but do women have more choices for both contraception and for HIV prevention? And I think many of us would look back and say the answer is not enough change in method mix. And irrespective of the MAC, irrespective of the way in which recommendations are guided, the clarion call in 2011 was, we need not just better options to be developed, but we need better options to be delivered. And we have not made nearly as much progress in the last 6 years. And that just gets re-emphasized coming out of last week's WHO recommendation. So hopefully we can all find common ground on that call and really begin to track across the world, but particularly in East and Southern Africa, where this particular issue is most most important. So again, want to thank all of you for joining, and just know that this work is merely beginning in its next phase, and looking forward to working with all of you on it. Stay tuned for the next call sometime in April, and again, keep questions coming, and we look forward to working with you all going forward.
Thanks all, everybody. Please do be in touch, and have a great rest of your day.